I made an early morning exit from Santiago de Compostela. It was going to be quite a long day, some 92 kilometers to go. But my other motivation was that, as you can see here, there's not really any cycle paths as you're going out of the city, and these roads do get very busy. They'd been busy when I came in the previous evening, so I was keen to get out as early as possible. This, by the way, is actually marked as a cycle route on my map, even though it's also a footpath. But anyway, once you get off those roads towards the city centre, we are getting onto some quieter roads which are taking you out, but still busy enough. And then, of course, this little bit of near countryside, which has a bit of a shock towards the end of it, because there isn't a clear exit once you get down to where the main road is. However, there is a worn away earth bank, which is where I was able to pop the bike out just here. So now we are heading up towards the industrial zone, and there's the smoke in the distance. This is a vast business park. I think there are something like 30,000 people employed here in all, on the northeastern corner of the city, and I'm not quite sure what the factory producing all the smoke is, but very noticeable for a long way out, and let me assure you, you could certainly also smell it. However, once we get there, we're going underneath the various railways and motorways that surround the city, and here we finally hit some nice agricultural bits. Here also I have now split off the route in yesterday, so if you watched my video coming in, this is where I'm about to split off from it. Yep, and so here on it's going to be different. So it was a nice misty morning, quite atmospheric to cycle on. I think it was a Sunday morning if I remember correctly, so very, very little traffic for this initial bit of the journey. I was the only person out of bed, I think, apart from the odd dog barking at me from the distance. This was day 11 of my 22-day tour of northern Spain, and in fact by the time I get to the end of the day, not only am I exactly halfway through in terms of days of cycling, but also pretty much in terms of distance. I'm going to put an insert in a few minutes, which is me talking to the camera as I cycle about what the experiences have been so far, so I'm not going to get into that in any more detail here. However, we are now on one of the main roads, and then coming off it again as we approach the town of Sigueiro, I think it's pronounced, which is one of the very few crossing points over the River Tambre that's coming up. So that's, I think, one of the longest rivers in Galicia. It's about 180 kilometers long. Here it is. And that bridge we just came over is a medieval one. So I stopped here for breakfast. I can't remember the exact cost of this, but it was very little before setting out for my next goal, which was the start of an old rail trail. Now this, I didn't know how cyclable it was going to be. It seems to have opened relatively recently, the previous year, and I had decided not to try the bridge that may or may not have taken me across the river. I've actually since been pretty convinced that it probably wouldn't have, but I think the intention is to eventually extend it to Santiago. This cycle lane here is, by the way, confusing, because is it dual way or is it single way? That threw me, and then that meant that I missed my turn, came over the bridge here, came back across, and then found my way down onto the cycle track. So seeing that will hopefully mean you don't need to make the same mistake again. So this is the Via Verde Compostela-Tambre, which is running from is the old rail line that ran from Santiago. Now there's a whole interesting history around that line, and I'll tell you a bit about that now. So this rail line had been under consideration since 1864. It goes from Santiago to A Coruña, and that's the really big port, and in particular a big naval port, so obviously a rail line would be valuable. But it only really got started in 1927 because the terrain's very difficult. There are 19 tunnels had to be built along it of total length 8.5 kilometers on a route that was only 74 kilometers long. Now the construction of the railway got a bit underway in 27, but it stalled with the Civil War, and it wasn't until March 1943 that it was completed. So here's the grim bit of history of that railway. It was completed because of the hundreds of thousands of prisoners Franco had kept after the Civil War and worked in slave labour camps, many of whom died. The prison detachments, according to the information boards, were located near the large construction sites, and it was the bosses of the companies that had been awarded the contract who went to the prisons to select the staff, the healthiest and strongest. After their release, many prisoners continued working in the same companies. Since their sentences always included exile, they had lost all their property and could not return to their surroundings. So in other words, the Republican prisoners from the Civil War, even if they didn't die underneath what were often very horrific prison conditions, even if they weren't executed, were still exiled from the towns and villages they came from, so had a real struggle to rebuild their lives in the aftermath. And as that notice board points out, it didn't just affect them, but it also affected their spouses, most often wives, who found they had also been virtually turned into slaves. So it's a beautiful railway line, very impressive, running alongside the river for most of its length, but the history is indeed a little bit chilling and perhaps off-putting. Now, that said, it was a beautiful sunny morning, the cycling was good. As you can see, there's not that many people on it. I think they said only 28,000 people used it in 2023, but it's becoming more popular, and once it's extended, I think particularly to Santiago, more will use it. So in the end, I haven't recorded anything like as many two-camera pieces as I'd intended. Generally, I'm too busy trying to work out where I'm going, or too tired, or the road's too dodgy, or it's too bumpy, or whatever. But I'm on the Greenway that runs from about 20 kilometers north of Santiago, and just thought I'd do a chat here. It's about halfway on the trip. I think this is day 11. As usual, I've kind of lost track of the days. I know it's Sunday. And yeah, certainly it's been very spectacular so far. I mean, you'll probably have seen the photos on the Instagram and the bits of video I have posted there. As usual, you only capture a tiny fraction of the spectacular stuff you see because you're coming down a steep hill and you can't really stop for photos or whatever. But I think it probably gives a reasonable impression. I have pretty much complete handlebar footage using time-lapse, so I'll be able to use that and upload it as well. And now I am heading north from Santiago towards the Atlantic coast stroke Bay of Biscay. I think it's called the Coast of Death, in fact, because there used to be a lot of shipwrecks. And then I'm alternating between following the coast for a bit and then going into the mountains and into some of the national parks. Now, I'm a little bit unsure about the mountainy bit. There's a lot of ascents involved, a couple of days with 2,000 meters in them, and my legs are feeling the distance so far. I have a couple of yesterday was a long day, today is going to be a long day. Tomorrow I can cut some of it off, it'll be a bit milder, so we'll see how I get on. Oh, and I'm just coming up to a tunnel here, this is exciting. I hope it's got automatic lights that turn on. We'll see. I should take off my sunglasses really, shouldn't I? Anyway, here we go. Does it have lights? It doesn't have lights, oh my god. This is kind of exciting. Alright, I'm just going to, I can see light at the other end, so it's just hope there's not a huge pit. I have a good headlight on my bike which is lighting up the path about 2 meters ahead of me, so if there was a significant obstacle or a bottomless pit, I think I'd probably see it. But yes, so I might stick to the coast, I might cut out some of the mountain stuff. But we'll see how I'm doing, because your legs do get stronger this far in as well. It's just I haven't had a break now. By a break I mean a 60-kilometer day in a couple of days, so I'm feeling it in particular. And today's almost 100, and I'm about 35 in and going a little bit, not 35 in, about 30 in. But anyway, yeah, all going good. there hasn't really been anything that hasn't worked for me at all. A couple of very rough, muddy bits. One of which I posted extensively about on Instagram, but that would make a little funny story in itself. And a couple of bits of high traffic, very fast road that, while I didn't love, they're no worse than the equivalent back home. Voila. So I think it should all be manageable with that. I'll spin this around and go back to time lapse. So the Greenway, as I cycled it, is 28 kilometres long. That's a section that went out of use when the high-speed rail went underground, well, mostly underground in 2011 on a slightly different route. But the final aim is for it to be 36 kilometres long. And it's running alongside the Tambre River, as I said, which is about 130 kilometres long. It's been included, apparently, in the top 5 Spanish greenways. And this was interesting to read because I was like, oh, I've done 2 of these, which was the Montes de Hierro in the Basque Country. That's the one that took me out of Bilbao. And Senda de Oso in Asturias. Now, that's going to be spectacular. And actually, the great thing about that greenway is I didn't even realise I was going to be cycling it until I was cycling out of the mountains, took a turn, and I went, oh, this looks like it's going to be a railway line. But yeah, it's very impressive. It's gorgeous and all sorts of things. So when we get to that, you'll enjoy it. I'm on this one until I reach the 40 kilometre mark, in which case I'm then going to be splitting off into the hills. Today I think it's 92 kilometres in all, which really was quite an ambitious distance to be covering. But I needed to make my way up around the side of A Coruña, which is basically why I'm going up into the hills and then out again. That whole bit of the coast is very developed. It's a very big city. I had thought of cycling into it to have a look at the Tower of Hercules at the port, which is an old Roman lighthouse. Might even be earlier than Roman, in fact. But I decided the trip in and out was a little bit too far in terms of the route. I mean, this decision making on this bit of the route was the most challenging because I had also hoped to go to Finisterre with my first thought about this. That was the initial end point going west, but I realised that I would be doing when I booked the ferry tickets and then I was working out the distance, I realised that I'd be trying to do too much of a distance every day. I needed to cut it back a little, and having cycled the entire route after the 22 days, as you'll see as I get further into it, I'm very glad I came to that decision. It was quite tough towards the end and that wouldn't have helped much more. If you're new to the channel, please do consider subscribing at this point if you found it interesting this far. I guarantee you will find all my other Spain videos fascinating. This is the 11th, but also the ones around the Highlands of Scotland and the Western Islands, and also, of course, the entire Irish coastline as well as the waterways. I have something like 180 videos in the archive, so one of the joys you can have if you go over the entire of the last 3 years is watch my hair turning from being completely shaved to my current whatever the hell it is mop as I experiment for the final time with growing my hair long. It's not just a cycling channel, there's all sorts of things going on here. Anyway, the upper stage of this is where they're going through a lot more hills, so quite often you're cycling down into a cut like here, and that's because as you come up from Santiago to Coruña, there's actually quite a lot of hills in the middle of that part, and so this is the part that we're going to be coming up over them. And as I come up here, I turn right a little bit before the end of the trail. I believe there's about another 2 kilometres or so I could have followed it through, but the right turn made sense for me because I'm going to be heading up some quite steep hills and then down a fantastic descent by a couple of reservoirs. Now, day 11 of this entire trip meant that I was quite a long bit outside the part where I'd been able to do any planning in advance. At this stage, all I'd been doing was booking, looking to see what hotels were available roughly in the direction I was travelling at a distance of about 80 to 100 kilometers each day, and then booking them, and then doing that for the next day, and then doing that for the next day. Running my route map then between them. I use Cycle Travel for plotting maps. It's very good at connecting you up via quiet roads, and in particular for finding things like these old rail trails. Almost none of them I knew I was going to cycle in advance. I came across them, but my map was routing me onto them. So if you want to do a kind of pain-free way of routing yourself for trips, that's certainly much easier than spending a very long time over pen and paper and trying to research. And actually, one of the things I found even coming back when I now know what to look for is that I've been able to find very, very little information on almost any of these trails whatsoever. Even trying to Google in Spanish, and in this case actually Galician, there's relatively little online. Now, I suspect that is a language barrier in parts. It's probably, I don't know quite what term to look for, but I've also been struggling a bit with trying to construct historical narratives about this part of the journey, because there's just not much there. So here we're getting onto the turn right, heading up to Pontedeume, and then there'll be a beautiful descent once I've got up there. I'm now well off the busy roads, as you can see. There's very short segments of 2 lanes, but mostly these are a return to those single track cart roads, as they're called, which run throughout Galicia and are considered to be following the routes of old cart tracks, that they're just basically tarmac atoms. Some of these are indeed quite rough. They feel like they're still cart tracks, but they're going up into the hills and up through these eucalyptus plantations. Galicia is actually quite heavily forested. Some of that is old traditional wood like chestnut and oak, but quite a lot is this sort of modern eucalyptus that's growing in plantations, you know, the trees planted in straight lines going straight up in the air and being harvested at intervals. And as I get further into northern Galicia, where there's a lot more of these eucalyptus plantations, I'm going to have a few close encounters with lumber trucks, which is the one hazard. The only advantage, though, as I'll say at the time, is with lumber trucks is you can hear them coming from a very long way away. So here we're descending to one of the reservoirs. That's a big place apparently for seabirds and a wide variety of ducks. It's one of the few places that's actually listed as a tourist attraction up here. And the Galician coast is very developed for tourism, and you'll see that a little bit further into this trip today, because we get into the coastal region after 11 days. I'm going to finally reach the Atlantic. But the inland bit, there doesn't seem to be so much. There hasn't been that much thought into it. Further on along here, we're going to get onto some bike trails. This is the descent coming up, so this is fantastic. I took a picture from the top, and then you're going down into it, and then it's a whole load of tight S-bends, which are always a little bit disappointing camera wise, because you can't really catch the speed and the tightness of the descent of each of them as you're coming down. It always feels like it's a little bit slow, I think, but are quite thrilling to actually ride. That's coming down into a valley where there are several small villages and towns, and then we'll be coming back out of that other side of that valley and heading up into the hills again. That's a very steep hill there, by the way. That's why I'm suddenly wobbling from side to side. That's me really having to pull on the bike. On a long day today, like today, battery range is of course an issue. I'm going to be covering 92 kilometers, and as you can see already, an awful lot of that is hills and quite a lot of it is rough surfaces. And of course, particularly with the rough surfaces, I never know in advance how many of them there's going to be, how long they're going to be, and from experience, they're the thing that can have the greatest impact on battery range. With steep hills, you at least have the thing that you're going up and using a lot of battery power, but then you're coming down and you're not using any battery power, so it doesn't quite even out. But it's not as severe a drain on batteries as you think. But if you're on really rough track, that's just going to be slow going, with of course the worst being anything that resembles sand, because it's like cycling through treacle all the time. The other point about today was that, as you've probably noticed, I'm not really passing any cafes or pubs or things like that, which is always a bit of a challenge. So I've been carrying emergency supplies since Burgos, so the end of the second day. I popped into a supermarket. I'll tell you exactly what those are in a minute, so I won't spoil it by telling you now. But it turned out that today was the day I was going to be glad, because apart from that breakfast way back, I hadn't really encountered anywhere on the road itself where I could eat. And I was having a look at Google Maps on some of these bigger towns, and there wasn't anything open, and that's probably because it was a Sunday afternoon. So particularly rural Spain is pretty notorious that on Sunday afternoons you can easily get to the situation where almost nothing is open, and that can in fact also include shops and supermarkets. And again, once I get to the end of my day, I'm going to hit that problem again in terms of finding somewhere to eat. But here we're coming up for my lunch break any moment now, I think. It's Sunday lunchtime, and the route I'm on has much more isolated than I expected it to be, so I haven't actually passed anywhere that's open, and in terms of my map there's no one on the route for the next 20 kilometres, so I have resorted to my emergency food, which is basically a crisp baguette. I bought some long life bread way back in Burgos, so it's about 8 or 9 days old at this stage, and kept the bottom of a packet of crisps for just this sort of occasion. And so I'm putting the crisps into the very sweet baguette, and actually it's quite palatable and lightweight, so good emergency food. I have a few chocolate bars as well, so I won't starve, but yeah, I'll eat well tonight. You see what I mean about the hair there? I shaved my head once when I came back, so I'm about, 6 months now into having longer hair. Anyway, an irrelevant aside to it all. There's a network of these little roads that are labelled as cycle tracks in some places as you're coming through this. So I'm guessing there's probably a cycle route coming up from one of the cities, possibly from A Coruña, now that I think about it, because I'm quite close to it here. But I wasn't following that particular cycle route. I was just following the route map that Cycle Travel had put together for me. And as you can see, that's really very satisfactory. Very little traffic. It's nearly all these little narrow roads coming along, and I'm heading now towards the ocean for the first time in 11 days. I mean, because I live in Ireland and you're always, I'm in Dublin, I'm never very far from the sea. I always get a little bit itchy when I'm any distance at all from the sea, so I was quite pleased to spot it again. But first of all, before we actually get to the sea, we're going to return to an old friend of ours, which is the Miro River. This is on the left hand side as we're coming along here, basically a couple of big lakes of it just before it heads to A Coruña and goes into the sea there. I think I'm going to come out beside it at the bottom. I didn't really have the chance to stop and investigate these, but they actually did look pretty interesting. They were kind of quite swampy, coming right up to the edge of the road, and that river is the longest river in Galicia and the fourth longest river in Spain. So it's quite a significant track in itself. That, I think, is it visible over the hedge, and as you can see, it's coming out over the road on these parts. There had been a fair amount of rain in the last couple of days, so possibly that level's a bit higher than it usually would, but also possibly this riverside road is just not something they worry too much about because there's very little traffic going over it. So at this stage we're now really skirting the edge of the motorways leading into A Coruña, and we're seeing a couple of those as I'm crossing them, and now we're climbing up over the last hill and ridge line before I get to reach the coast proper, and the first sight I will have of the ocean in 11 days. If you want to follow the route I'm doing, and I mean actually follow it yourself, you will find in the description a link to my route map on Cycle Travel for the entire 22 days around Spain. You could obviously not do the whole lot and just get to one part or another. That's relevant actually because I'm approaching the coast, because although I haven't had the chance to research this yet, there is, as far as I can tell, a light railway, a narrow gauge track that actually runs all along the coast from Bilbao and will connect you to several of the towns I've been on. And as far as I can tell, again, I haven't researched this fully, you can actually bring bicycles on that, so it would be possible to get the ferry to Bilbao as I did, and then to perhaps use that train to get down the coast. It's probably a relatively slow process, but it's not going to be any slower than the 8 or 9 days it took me to cycle back. So anyway, that's one top tip for you there. So we just crossed the last of the motorways there, and we're heading across the headland to come down on the Atlantic. So this is a botanic gardens here that's quite well recommended, and the Atlantic is just over that wall, or rather it's a river estuary that becomes the Atlantic. We're going to be coming up, and that bridge ahead is what I'm heading to. Now, bridges make me nervous because often there isn't any good cycling routes across them, and this one was no different. So it's kind of a question of these long ones of just summoning up your courage, going for it, and hope there's no traffic behind you till you get to the other end, which is what happened there. It probably helped that I was doing it on a Sunday afternoon, and there beyond is the Atlantic. So these headlands, they're very built up tourist-wise. This is an old town. There's also a lot of new modern apartment blocks. However, it turns out there is also a network of these sort of very small local roads again, crossing in between the headlands. The kind of flatter routes are dominated by they're not quite motorways, but they're sort of heading towards dual carriageways. It's not really the sort of thing you want to be cycling on. But these routes are, in any case, by far the more scenic of the two. In terms of looking ahead at my route map, there was a very puzzling bit I knew was coming up here, and I couldn't quite work out what exactly it was. It was a very sharp set of turns, and so I actually overshot it, but yep, that's what it was. It's a bridge over the railway, quite narrow, and then down again, and that's now taking me through the last of the towns on this side of the headland. Now, as has often happens on my trips, the batteries for my GoPro are running low at this point. They are going to shortly cut out, and so you're going to miss the very last couple of kilometres of this particular cycle over the headland. There's nothing particularly interesting up there. It's modern apartment blocks with a steep ascent up to them and then a fast descent down. The last bit of the ascent down, though, is interesting because that's coming down through the town of Pontedeume, I think it's pronounced, which is where I was going to be staying that night, and it's fantastically narrow, steep streets, many of which are cobbled. That's the route across the headland for you, just in case you're reproducing it. And a view of the bridge at Pontedeume. This is my hotel room, the route of the Camino de Angles, and here was tonight's dinner. Well, not quite dinner, but unfortunately there were no restaurants open till 8. I got there at about 4, so I had to live off the snack machines, but then I went out for tapas in the evening in a local restaurant. Again, cost me very little, and that was the end of day 11. So the end of day 11, the halfway point takes us up to this top corner. We're here. Tomorrow we're going to be going up a little bit further to reach the most northerly point of the trip, and then coming back down along the coast, including, as I move to one side, that dip down into the mountains, which is going to be some of the most spectacular cycling of the entire trip. Do give the video a like if you haven't done so already. You've watched it this far, you must enjoy it, helping to push it out to more people, and hopefully those of you who've been following my journey along are feeling a little bit inspired by it, are more inclined to take up cycle touring if you're not already, or if you are, you've got a new idea here. This northern Spain route is fantastic, and hopefully someday I will see you on the road.